How does it happen that those who maybe control other people are transformed into relational beings who want to relate well? Those who back away from other people, especially in a marriage relationship, how is it that they are transformed into those who want to handle conflict differently, who don't want to be in conflict? Um, those who don't know how to draw close to each other, who don't know friends, who don't know how to get in touch with one another. Is it that they are transformed and radically changed into people, into beings who relate in the same way that the members of the Trinity relate? How is that? How does the Bible teach us about this? We're transformed according to God's intentions for how he wants to transform us into relational beings. And I would say to you that occurs, according to Scripture, by the renewal of our minds. That's not just the way we think. Sometimes the renewal of our mind is a new emotional experience that changes our mindset, our perspective. So today I'm going to talk about how our capacity to think, to perceive, the fact that we have minds, that we are people who look at data and draw conclusions somehow. If we're going to change, it's going to depend on changing our minds, coming into that place where there's a change occurring, a renewal of our minds. And if we're going to be effective at giving pastoral counseling, we're going to have to relate to other people in a meaningful way. If we're going to enter into the battle for their souls and move into the depths of who they are and to release the power that is within us into somebody else's life, the effect is going to be that we get them to change the way they're thinking. And that's going to transform us as well as them. And that's our topic for this lecture. We have the capacity to perceive, and it's pivotal, it's central. We have a capacity to understand it. If we're going to understand people and their problems, we need to understand those. A while ago, when I was in practice as a counselor, I recall stepping into the waiting room. I do that every time I go and get a new client, and it was between appointments, and I was greeted by a person who was a helper, an office assistant, who looked at me and said something disturbing. He said, "Dan, I just called your home to speak to your wife," and a man's voice answered, and I asked to speak to your wife, and he replied that she's not home right now. And this man on the phone said that. And my helper said, "What do you suppose is happening? Did you call the phone company?" I said, "Well, no, I don't have any reason to call the phone company. Our phone had no problems. So I don't know who's in our home, and certainly there should be nobody in the home, no man that I know of. So I called the house, and the line was busy, and somebody is talking on the phone." And as I relayed that to my helper, I said, "The line's busy now." The helper looked at me calmly, not particularly warm way, and said, "How does it feel knowing right now, even as we are talking about this, that your home is being robbed?" I thought, "Now wait a minute. Crooks don't answer telephones. They don't say, someone's not home, not home right now. We're on a job, so call back later." No, a robber wouldn't do that. So it made me think, what's going on? Somebody's in my house and nobody's home, and my wife is away on a trip, and my sons are in school, and my house is empty, and my line was busy, and I got alarmed, and so I called the police, and they said that they would somebody would go over and take a look, and I said, I'm a tax-paying citizen, and I'm concerned, and this is what's going on. And what do you mean, somebody's? And I said, "Well, what's happening is I would like very much if you could meet me at my house and we could check on the home together. I don't want to go in there alone, and I would appreciate if I could have some support. Can you send an officer to meet me there?" And they did, and I waited a few minutes, and I drove home, and there were some police cars out in front of my house, and we went into the front door. It was locked, and the policemen were already inside. They had let themselves in through the back door, which was unlocked. And I kind of do that on a regular basis, especially if the children lock themselves out of the um, house. And the senior officer had a clipboard, and on the clipboard was all a piece of paper, and it said burglary report. He said to me, "You're the owner here." I said, "Yes." "And what's your name?" I said, "My name is Dan, and here's the address." And he said, hate to tell you this, Dr. Bush, there has been some burglaries in the neighborhood. It's a nice neighborhood, and your house has obviously been the last one on the list to get hit here, because we've been now doing this just for a couple of minutes. We've gone through your entire house, and we looked pretty quickly at your house, and it's a train wreck. Every room has been disheveled, and everything is out of place. And the robbers were looking for who knows what. Maybe they've got some jewelries or something like that. We don't have any paintings. We don't really have much. So, um, but they've gone through the entire house and they've wrecked it. And I'm sorry about that, but you'll need to go to the entire house and you'll have to give us a report of what's missing. I said, okay. And I was bummed out because that was a lot of work and it was just a hassle I didn't want to have. So we walked through the house, and I came back to the policeman and I said, I don't really know how to tell you this, but I left the house this way myself. Nothing is out of place. We're just kind of really busy people these days and haven't been able to clean everything up. Um, Wife's been gone for a week, and I guess the train wreck is me. I was a little bit embarrassed to say that, to be honest. Think about the story. Think about the policeman. Here he is. He had the capacity to perceive. He's looking at all that is going on inside the house, and what does he do with that data? Well, he concludes something, but he came to the wrong conclusion. He looked at the data and he evaluated it. He had the capacity to perceive, and I suppose his position was nobody in their right mind would be so messy, especially in this kind of neighborhood. So it had to be a crook. I couldn't be the choice to live like this. I couldn't be the one who was so messy and clothes all over the floor, things not put away, etc. He came to the conclusion. The conclusion was based on the perception of data, but the perception was wrong. I was that messy. Both his behavior and his emotions grew out of the perception, and he looked at the data. He drew the conclusion, and as a result of drawing that conclusion, my house was the last on a rash of burglaries, and he found himself getting angry. More crooks, more courts going to throw it out. These crooks are going to get away with it. I'm mad about the whole thing. This was the attitude of the police officer. He was feeling somewhat based on this data. Was it reality? No, it wasn't. It was what he was perceiving. He was feeling something based on his perception, and he was behaving in certain ways based on what he understood. And he was filling out a burglary report. He was taking action based on what is understood. So if you want to change the way he feels, if you want to change what he does, then what has to change? He can be transformed by the renewing of his mind. The change that needs to be to return him to the kind of emotional life, a certain kind of behavior, depends on changing the perceptions. My daughter once was very angry that a friend didn't call her back, and I said, "Well, do you know that your friend is dissing you?" And she's like, "I don't really know that, but it feels like that. They're not calling me back." I said, "Well, what if your friend told you that her phone's battery died and she was on a trip for a 2-hour car ride and couldn't plug it in, and by the time she got home, she forgot about it?" I said, "What if you learned about that? How would your attitude and your response and your emotions change?" And she admitted that would probably change everything. She wouldn't be so mad at her friend. You see, the emotions that we have sometimes and the actions that we take come out of what we perceive. And one psychologist expressed this thought very, very simply by talking about the ABC theory. He said that you might want to let A stand for activating circumstances. The A for activating circumstances, the circumstances that activate something. And here are the things that happen. Your wife gets mad at you, your best friend betrays you, your boss tells you about the economy is so bad and you're going to lose your job, and that's the activating circumstance. Something happens, and then with your capacity to perceive, you look at the data of life, just like the policeman looked at the data of my messy house, and you look at the data of your life and you draw certain conclusions because you're capable of evaluating your world and drawing conclusions on the basis of your evaluation. And when you have a belief based on what you see, the belief then determines how you feel and what you do. So you have A, the activating circumstance, and B, the belief, right? This is not a spiritual or theological belief. This is the perception, right? The belief of what it means. It's the meaning that you make from taking in the data from that activating circumstance. That's the B. And C, the consequence, both emotionally and then the behaviors that come out of that. So you have a response to the belief. You have an emotional response and you have a behavioral response. That's the ABC theory of emotion. Now, I want you to consider the Bible for a moment. In the Apostle Paul in the Bible, the verse that I want to bring to your mind is Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. That real change depends on something happening inside our minds. Paul is making the assumption that as men and women who bear the image of God, we have a rational capacity. We are capable of perceiving our world and drawing conclusions about it. I want you to think about this capacity to perceive for a moment, because it is crucial to effective pastoral counseling. As I'm talking to a friend who's struggling with a life and they have a presenting struggle, they perceive the meaning of what they are experiencing, and they begin to draw conclusions with it, and they come up with beliefs. And as a result, the friend is going to respond. They're going to move in certain directions based on the conclusions. They're going to have certain emotional responses based on their conclusions. And suppose your friend's conclusions just happen to be wrong. It happens. Sometimes we're just wrong. Do I understand people and problems? To do so, I've got to understand the capacity to perceive. Think of it this way. Consider what happens when a little girl who, in this scenario, was sexually abused. And I want to consider what happens when that little girl is abused. And we'll agree at the outset that this is a horrible experience, okay? It should never happen, and it's horrible. That being said, let's explore this a little bit. The girl is the victim in this thing. It's not her fault. She didn't do it. She didn't ask for it. It was abuse. The fault of the bad person that did these things to her is the perpetrator of the evil crime against the innocent little girl. Of course, that's all true. It's a bad thing. But I want you to consider what happens in this little girl's interior world for a moment. If we're going to provide effective pastoral counseling, we need to enter the soul that has some idea for what's going on inside there. Now, what is the capacity to perceive? And how is it functioning inside of this little girl when she is sexually abused? I do want you to think about that together with me for a moment. Begin the obvious assumption that we are making clearly that this little girl is a soul, right? I don't like the phrase she has a soul. Little girl is a soul. She's a personal being. She's someone who desires, has the capacity to desire, as we've talked about before, and she has a capacity to want. It's a capacity. I don't say she's wanting it, but I'm saying there is the capacity to want what God intended for her to enjoy. She longs to be celebrated by her mom and her dad. She longs to be safe in arms of a strong person who has the power to protect her. She longs to give all that is within her that's beautiful to be enjoyed, all that's there. that she has a capacity to desire. She's a personal being who longs for things. She was created with that capacity by a loving God who has created her in this good community image. And then, not this good community image, I mean, not confuse you, his good community image. Who's the good community of God? It's the Trinity, right? And he's created in that image. And then this little girl with the capacity to desire, like we talked about in the last lecture, this little girl whose joy depends on certain quality of relationship that's being experienced, and something happens, like this horrible thing that we're talking about. Some person uses her in a way that God would never use her, in a way that a godly person would never use her. Somebody uses her with no thought of her deeper value as a person and what the effect on her is going to be. She becomes merely an object to be enjoyed by the other person, but as somebody who wants to love her. And that's what happens in sexual abuse. There is no way to dress it up to make it less vile than what it is. But here's what I want you to understand. When this little girl is abused, her mind begins to go to work. She's not simply experiencing pain, she's perceiving data of her world. And she's going to come up with certain conclusions, certain beliefs, certain assumptions that are going to guide her in her life. How does that work? She experiences the data of the emotional trauma. She experiences the experience of being violated. And without having to be taught, she knows that something inside her feels awful. She knows that something inside her is being violated. She knows that there is a design that is not being followed, that is being violated, that something is being missed, that something is going on. And her abuser, as so often happens, let's assume that her abuser is somebody that she has trusted, who has built up confidence in him or her, and he was or she was able to use the relationship as an opportunity to move towards her in this very, very, very bad way. Now, as she reasons and reflects on the experience, and it's not the reasoning and reflecting of a very mature older person, it's the reasoning and the reflecting as a 5-year-old girl, and gets out her notepad and she begins to think through her rational processes. She doesn't do that, right? No, she's 5. But these things are happening nonetheless. And she's thinking through things because she has the God-given ability to perceive as a human being. She has the capacity from God to think. And what he wants this little girl to do is to say, no, no matter what happens in my life, God is good, God is faithful, God is worthy of trust. That's what God would have her say. But is that the way she thinks in the middle of the abuse? The answer is, if that were to happen, that would be a great miracle if she were able to see things and perceive it that way. But maybe that's something that pastoral counseling can bring about. That God is faithful at the moment of the abuse. Was God faithful during the Holocaust? What does it mean? What is she perceiving about God in the middle of the data of her abuse? What is she concluding about life and how she should live her life? Well, her mind is going to work and she's forming a belief. Really, she's forming a series of beliefs. And as you think about it, as you come up with another list of beliefs, maybe I would think maybe she's sitting back loosely and not trying to be terribly careful in my thought here, but maybe this little 4, 5, 6-year-old girl in the middle of abuse would draw certain conclusions. She would start believing certain things with her capacity to perceive, that she would probably start by saying that, well, the world is a dangerous place. Bad things happen in the world. We could understand her perceiving that. I'm not sure if my own daughter, she was 3 or 4 a long time ago. I don't know if she knew then that the world's a dangerous place. Her world back then was pretty safe, No man touched her wrongly. She had a father that loved her, took her out for breakfasts. We had dad and daughter dates, and we played and we read books together. I was not a dangerous person for my daughter, and my wife was not. And my daughter's not afraid of the world. Her mom and dad were terrific parents, or pretty good, and she lived a pretty safe life. She's well adjusted. But the time is going to come, where not everybody has that kind of experience. Hopefully, they don't come up against abuse, but in some form, in all of our lives, the time does come when we come up against something that happens and makes us say, I'm not safe in this world. This world is a dangerous place. Maybe a belief invades our psyche. We all come to this place where we begin to perceive. And secondly, maybe that little girl who's been abused might say something like this, that no one can be counted on to protect me, as I legitimately want to be protected. Now, again, realize that we're talking about this. This is not a friend of yours who's 35 years old. This is a little girl. She was 5. And this is a friend of yours who's struggling with her relationship with guys, or with her roommates, and with her girlfriends, and with people at work. And she's not close in any relationships. And maybe she's feeling a lot of anxiety and depression as she's talking to you. And maybe you notice she's not really that close to God, although she kind of believes that there is this higher power God. And you're wanting to enter the battle for her soul, and you're wanting to think about this 35-year-old woman now you're talking to, and you realize she tells you that once long ago, when she was 5 years old, and she had the capacity to perceive and to desire, that this bad thing happened to her. But perhaps you get to know her pretty well as you're doing the counseling, and you hear about all of her abuse, and you begin to realize that in the interior of her world, of her life, beneath the surface of the struggles with her colleagues and her job frustrations and her relationships, that she begins to perceive the world as it is a dangerous place. And you're saying, well, you know what? I kind of get that. I kind of believe that, yeah, maybe it is. And she's concluding that there's nobody out there whatsoever that she can count on to protect her as she wants to be protected. And you struggle with that one, and you say, I think that too, but I know that God is my protection, that God is my refuge and my rock, and my strong tower and my anchor and my defender. And the scriptures tell me that, and I kind of believe that. And he doesn't always do it the way I wish it were to be done. He doesn't always protect me from certain things. Sometimes I walk through the valley of the shadow of death that I legitimately wish I wouldn't have to walk through, or never came near. So, but sometimes the conclusion that some other people draw is that no one can be counted on to protect me. And that's there, that she came to that conclusion when she was 5, with her capacity to perceive. And maybe I would suggest a third thing, that she draws on this conclusion. The world's a dangerous place. I can count on no one to protect me from its danger. I must therefore look out for myself. I'm always on the defensive. I'm always looking out for myself. I believe that the reality of living in this world leads us to a lot of conclusions. But one of the primary conclusions that we all grow up believing at some point is that to trust another, to trust, is to commit suicide. So put yourself in great danger. How can you trust anybody? That might just result in destruction, because nobody is worthy of trust, are they? We look at God and we say, you didn't protect me from the abuse. We look at our fathers and we say, you weren't there when the abuse took place. We look at our mothers and say, you weren't there when certain things took place, and when I was hurt in certain ways, you didn't move towards me properly. Can I trust anybody? Yes, I'll receive what I can from people, but fundamentally, nobody is there in this dangerous world. I must depend upon my own resources to make my world work. To trust is dangerous. I must never let myself go in glad response to another. I must never, with spontaneous, can't even say the word, spontaneity and fullness of my feminine soul or my masculine soul, boys and girls the same. I must never just give who I am to another. If I do, that is too much of a risk. I better play it safe. I must always be on guard. You see how this perception is creating a response, an emotional response, and an action response. And the last thing I would suggest that maybe she learns from that abuse, and there are probably 20 things that we could think of, but the last thing I want to suggest to you with her capacity to perceive is that she is saying to herself, you know, and I've enjoyed the dangers, the greatest. Here's a man who looked at me with desire, and I found myself vulnerable, enjoying the fact that he enjoyed me, and I made myself vulnerable to him. And then he came and he enjoyed me in a perverse way that it didn't feel right. And so when I see somebody who wants to move towards me and love me and hold me and snuggle me and emotionally move towards me, something in me gets on guard. And when I'm enjoyed, I hurt. The danger is very present. So what is enjoyable about me must be hidden from all. I must see to it that nobody has a reason to enjoy me. Why is it that I have met a number of women who, by the way they dress and by the way they comport themselves, seem to be insisting on a message that there is nothing about me as a woman that is worthy of enjoying. I will not give you my warmth. I will not give you my tenderness. I will not give you my beauty. I will not give you anything. It's too risky. I've been hurt before. No. But more happens than just learning a series of beliefs, you see. Certainly that happens. That's certainly foundational. That's huge. But the little girl's capacity to perceive, when the abuse takes place, she learns a variety of beliefs that become to her very real. But more than learning beliefs, she forms some images of herself, some images of other people, and most certainly an image of who God is. And now I want you to consider a fact that almost every therapist has seen. Abused children typically blame themselves for the abuse. Crazy, huh? Now, in 99.9% of the cases, there's nothing that can be further from the truth. The abused child is not to be blamed. My own wife is a victim of sexual abuse. I say that with permission. It was not her fault. An older cousin who was handicapped and not mentally stable did something very bad. She was a victim. Why then do victims of sexual abuse not blame the perpetrator? Why do they blame themselves? That's typical, you know. The fault clearly lies with the abuser, but they blame themselves and they develop an image of themselves as bad and somehow cheap or dirty. Maybe they were seductive. They maybe have that belief, or something is wrong with me that precipitated this horrible experience, that brought it about. Somehow it's my fault. Somehow I deserved it. Is that conviction of sin? No, it's not. It's counterfeit. Satan's counterfeit lie. Let me explain what I mean by that. Assume every child from conception on, from the day the child is conceived in the womb, through the day that the child emerges into the world as a fully functional human being, as a little 1-day-old baby, little girl, little boy. Assume that every child from the beginning sees God as less than fully good. And by the way, that's part of the doctrine of depravity, the doctrine of sin. None of us come into the world say, God, you are absolutely wonderful and worthy of my trust. You are totally good. No, no, no. The legacy from Adam and Eve on down is the fall, you see. It's what gets us thinking, I'm not sure about you, God. I think I'll manage things without you. I'm fine. Thank you very much. If you want to help me, that's great. But if you don't, I'll get along without you. That's at the root of human sin. That's how we think. Assume that every child comes into the world not believing that God is good, fully good. And that means that somewhere deep down in the soul of of a little girl, or a little boy, somewhere down deep in the soul, there's a basic terror. There's a basic terror that says no one is here for me in the way in which I need someone to be here for me. I am therefore defenseless and I need a defender, but no one is there. Then the abuser comes and the abuse occurs in some form, maybe mild, maybe it's severe. And I have been describing, one moment here, I think my computer is running out of battery power. I thought it was plugged in. Let me make sure we get some power here. Oh, it came came unplugged. 1 second here. We're gonna get some power. Interesting lecture where you have to get lectured about plugging the power cord in, but that is important. And then we'll continue. Ah, there's the noise. It says we're plugged in. We're good to go. Okay. Now understand, we're going to go back to the story a bit here, right? There's a basic terror. It says no one here is for me in the way in which I would like them to be for me, that I need them to be for me. No one here is really my defender. Then the abuser comes and the abuse occurs. Maybe it's mild, maybe it's severe. But suppose a little child honestly evaluating from their little minds, they honestly perceive with their capacity to perceive accurately what happened. They say, someone has mistreated me. That part they got right. And it was not my fault. And I have no means to protect myself from having it happen again. What happens to their terror, their core terror? It escalates. It gets worse. Since they see no God who is there for them, they conclude, I must have to protect myself. So how do they protect themselves? Well, they can't protect themselves from abuse. That's been proven. They're little children. They're 5 years old. How can they guarantee that another bad person won't do something to them again? I want you to listen to this. A little 5-year-old girl, 5-year-old that's been abused, if she believes that she is at the mercy of hostile, dangerous forces in this world, she has no defense and she lives in unbearable terror. If, however, she concludes that this bad thing happened because I caused it, if it's my fault and I'm doing something wrong, then maybe I have the power to keep it from happening again, you see? Maybe with my resources, I can see to it. If I change certain ways of being, then I won't be at the mercy of this difficult world. If it's my fault, then maybe I can correct it. You see how where the mind goes? If I take it on board as mine, then maybe I can do something to relieve it from ever happening again. And so she forms an image of herself that's bad in order to gain power, you see. I see myself as bad. I see I can work at this being a little sweet girl that nobody would do this to, an angry, hostile person that nobody would want to come and do this to. Total neutering their femininity, that nobody would want to be drawn to me. I'm going to find some other way to be that so that this never happens again. Maybe I become super defensive. Maybe I become loud and brash. Maybe I become critical of the other people so they withdraw from me. All of this is a defensiveness. It's a function of the bad self-image. I want you to hear from that it is the bad self-image that is not learned, it is chosen. This carries huge implications for how we do pastoral counseling, for how we think about each other. When we hear their stories that are very difficult, we need to realize that if somebody tells you about their history of abuse and they begin to hate themselves, and self-hatred is not the result of bad education, that's now to be corrected with good education. Try talking to somebody out of a bad self-image. See how far you get. You never get very far. Why? Because that self-image is so deeply rooted. Because the problem with this little girl who has been abused is now she thinks this dirty little bad thing. The problem is not misinformation, and the problem is not even that it happened to her. As awful and as dreadful as that was, the real problem is moral. And listen to a very difficult sentence. And this sweet little girl who has been abused, who of course we feel badly for, who of course you want to protect from her ever having anything like that ever happen again. But in this little girl, there is a determination to believe a lie. Something in her is determined to believe what is not true. Remember where it all starts. It all started with the conviction that God is not good enough to be fully trusted with my deepest desires of necessity, and they are necessities. Therefore, I will deny the desires that I cannot satisfy, and God isn't going to. And I will live for desires that I can somehow manage, and I will make sure that I do whatever it takes to get these desires satisfied. And when something bad happens, I will look very frantically inside of myself and I will say, what did I do wrong that I can change? I was terrible here, bad self-image. It's useful to believe that because now I have something to work, something to go to work on, something to change, something to do, that I can keep myself safe. And now all of the pressure is on me. And now I've got to handle my own world, and I've got to handle it all on my own. And it happens within a blink of an eye that is the belief that they come to. And that's the 35-year-old person who's now sitting in front of you, and they're having lunch with you, and they're sharing their story and their struggle with you. And that's the relationships. It all begins with a naturally embedded rebellious attitude towards God, that something else happens, and then the ability to perceive, and it moves into a behavior, emotions and behavior. You and I, you see that we have this capacity to perceive, but this capacity to perceive has been deeply corrupted. Only the Lord Jesus, from the time of his conception through his entire life, with his capacity to perceive, was not subject to the corruption. He was not foolish. He always looked at the data and drew the right conclusion. And the right conclusion is that God is good. God knows what he's doing. God can be trusted. When I'm 12 years old, I must be about my Father's business, Jesus said. Because what matters more than anything else is that I be glorifying my Father and staying in fellowship with my Father. That 12-year-old thinks like that. Only one. Every other 12-year-old doesn't think like that. Every other 5-year-old, every 35-year-old, every 65-year-old takes a very, very different position. And the position says, I'm not sure if God is really good and if God can be trusted. There's a devotional writer, Oswald Chambers, he put it well when he said it this way: the root of all sin is the suspicion that God is not good. And because God may not be good, I will look at what happens, whether it's abuse or job loss or divorce or whatever. I will look at all of the difficult things that happen in my world, and I will say to myself, I will conclude this: I will find a way by myself to make my life work. The Bible teaches us that you and I, as people with the capacity to perceive, that we have a foolishness wound up inhabiting our hearts. And foolishness is the corruption of our capacity to perceive. And in order to understand people and their problems so we can provide effective pastoral counseling, it's crucial that we understand what the Bible means when the Bible tells us that we are foolish. What I'm going to do in the next lecture is that I'm going to look at how all of the foolishness begins with every child when they're born and goes through the various stages until, apart from the work of the Spirit of Christ, the foolishness grows into a weed and the person becomes a fool. And we're going to realize that without the work of the Spirit of Christ, we're all headed towards becoming and remaining fools. And I want you to know that that's what we're going to do in the next presentation or the next lecture. And I look forward to seeing you there very soon. See you then.